Hi there, Adam Gower here, and welcome to the Real Estate Crowdfunding Show, syndication in the digital age at gowercrowd.com. Today, I am thrilled to bring you one of my old friends from the Great Recession of 2007-2008, Richard Ormond, who is a font of all knowledge relating to the confluence of cannabis and commercial real estate. Richard is a shareholder at the law firm Buchalter in LA, and he and I first met and worked together over 12 years ago during the absolute heights of the recession, if you can talk heights during a recession, depths, whatever. Anyway, it was an extremely interesting time, and we worked on several very complicated and involved projects. Richard is one of the country's top real estate attorneys, and we've actually recorded a course on what investors should look for in real estate contracts when looking at deals. So I'll include links to that on today's podcast page at gowercrowd.com. Now, I have steered away from cannabis real estate deals because they've just seemed too hairy for me. One of the deals that I worked on when I was getting to know Richard, and while I was at the bank, was an industrial warehouse foreclosure that we did that had a dispensary in it. It was really tricky deal because as a bank, we couldn't own anything that derived revenues from a federally banned business, right? As cannabis was and continues to be. And it just struck me as being another layer of complexity on top of what is already a very complicated business, right? Commercial real estate. That said, I've been approached by several cannabis-related real estate businesses to help them raise capital from investors. So Felix, thank you for your interest in particular. So I figured out it was about time that I learned more about this business. And so I called Richard, who is a recognized authority, and share that discovery conversation with you now. Even if you're in a different field of commercial real estate, you'll find the conversation absolutely fascinating. And if you're an investor, be sure to check out the podcast page for today's episode, where you'll find that webcast on contracts that I put together and access to the contracts course in which Richard shares his insights into what to look for when investing in any kind of real estate deal online. That's all there on the podcast page at gowercrowd.com. Okay, that's it. Now it's time for a deep dive into how to make money from cannabis real estate and what to watch for as an investor. Ladies and gentlemen, both of you, here is Richard Ormond. Richard.
We're ready to rock and roll.
Fabulous to see you again. I love all those stories. I told you I watched that movie, Ford and Ferrari. Yeah. I didn't even know that you knew the guy. It's really impressive. Anyway, thanks for spending your time with me today. Today we're going to talk about cannabis, which is your expertise as a lawyer. I don't need to know about any other kind of expertise that you've got in the subject. I know it's where you really excel. So tell me first, as we jump, let's just jump straight in. Tell me first, we're connecting the dots between cannabis and real estate. So why would anyone invest in cannabis real estate?
So there's a couple of important factors. The first is that while people don't realize that there are barriers to entry to cannabis, there really are. And the primary barrier to entry is real estate, because you cannot get licensed locally without having a piece of real estate that's properly zoned in the right area and meets certain guidelines and restrictions based on whatever community you're in. You need that real estate. And so there's two ways to get that real estate. One is by leasing it, which is very expensive, or buying it, which is becoming more expensive. And of course, from an investment point of view, buying that real estate and then finding someone that's licensed to be an operator is an ideal situation. And you can make money in a few ways. Not only do you make money by having property that's green zoned, but you can also cut deals in your lease where you get percentage of profits, operations, things like that. So you can actually have a different trajectory and not just increase the value of your real estate from an equity perspective, but actually make money off of the lease in addition to rent. So you have rent plus profit participation and everything else. And there's many ways to skin that cat.
Now, if I was to invest in a cannabis real estate, somebody's putting this deal together like a producer, right? So they're a sponsor, they found the land. They found the building, they're in a green zone, they've got an operator inside that. And the whole business is oriented to a profitable cannabis business. My biggest concern would be, well, what happens if they lose the license? I mean, presumably they're overpaying for. By the way, I'm pulling this out my ear, but I've seen values of properties skyrocket because they have licenses, they're in the right zone, etc., etc., and go beyond any other kind of use value. So I'm paying that high value. Why would I not be concerned that I could lose my shirt as well if something goes wrong?
So obviously with any investment comes risk. And there is a risk in that regard. That's why choosing your operator is very, very important as to who's going to be on that property. But the license, the way in most districts, the way that it's kind of geared towards right now is that the license really is attached to the property more than is attached to the operator. You can switch out the operator, but you can't change where the location of the property is. So we actually see folks that do investment funds that they buy real estate or they finance real estate, and the operators may come and go because one thinks they have a better mousetrap than the other, but the property stays in the same place and it's easily rentable to the next person that thinks that they have a better mousetrap. The biggest risk I still think in this industry, while I have not seen it come to play in many years now, is that there's still the risk of the conflict of law between state law and federal law, because this remains illegal activity at the federal level. And what's the worst case scenario in a federal situation? It's risk of losing your property to federal seizure or criminal risk. So both those risks remain real today, despite the fact that we don't see enforcement. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we don't see enforcement. Part of it is that the federal budget restricts the amount of money that goes to law enforcement to enforce cannabis laws. And that is a complex discussion that would probably take us another hour to go through all the different nuances and exceptions and everything else. The other is the Treasury guidelines for how money is handled in that regard. And that has become something that is a little bit more fluid these days. And I think it's very difficult for law enforcement to take a strong position on that. So that works to the advantage of property owners, because those two factors are very difficult to nail down. But that's not to say that with a change in administration, a regime change, or whatever we have in this country coming in the next election, things could change for the better or they could change for the worse. And it's very hard to predict right now where that's going to go. Donald Trump has indicated and given kind of dog whistles to the cannabis industry, saying that he's going to try to normalize it if he gets reelected. The Democrats, on the other hand, have not been doing that, which is quite interesting to me, that they've taken kind of a non-position on cannabis. They haven't advocated for it. They haven't said no to it either. But it strikes me as odd, because I think it's an issue that would probably get people to the polls, and they're not using it to their advantage at this point.
That's interesting. So actually one of the risks, it's a political risk. This is a rare real estate investment opportunity that comes with it a political risk.
That's right.
Are there any others, just by way of comparison, that are like, other than entitlement risk and the usual thing?
No, I think the biggest risk you have is that political risk, and obviously the risk of some sort of seizure because your operator is doing something totally outside the law. As a lawyer, I'm very paranoid. And so when I set up a lease or an agreement with a landowner and an operator, we have something we call a green writer that we attach to the leases that kind of sets out a code of conduct that complies with local law, state law, and federal law as well, because there are ways to comply with federal law despite the fact that it remains illegal. There are so many different pathways that are legal, even under federal law, that we make sure that our leases are as compliant as they can be under the current legal system that we have.
Okay, so that dovetails very nicely into the next question, which is, how does, so if one is looking to invest in cannabis real estate, we're looking at a sponsor, right? Somebody who's buying the real estate, looking for equity from investors. So what kind of investing or what kind of investors are there? What kinds of sponsors are there? And I'll run off a few examples here. For example, there's these concepts, right? First crop, I don't even know what that is. Real estate, refinancing of existing properties, lines of credit. And the reason it dovetails in is because my knowledge of this was, as you know, you and I met when I was working at a bank, and we had to foreclose on a property that had a dispensary. And it was really problematic because we were unable at that time to accept rent from a federally prohibited tenant, basically.
That hasn't changed either. That remains the law.
So, tell me something then. What are the different complexions of sponsor? How do they actually invest in cannabis?
So there's a number of ways, and because of that inability for banks to be able to collect rent or even foreclose and own a property that has a cannabis connection to it, there has created a vacuum. That is a vacuum that is still in desperate need of money to fill it. The first is lending. Traditional real estate lending, people pay a nice premium to a private lender for giving them the financing that a bank won't give them right now. So a first trust deed, a very traditional mortgage or first trust deed secured by the real estate, is a very easy way to get involved. And I always tell people that are interested in doing this, I said, your biggest risks financially are that your mortgage doesn't get paid, but then you have the real estate as your security. It's very much just like any other real estate investment. I said, but the other advantage you have is that there's so many people lining up that think they have a better mousetrap, the term I used before, in the cannabis industry, that finding tenants is actually not that difficult right now. What we're going to see, however, is that there is a couple of risks that landlords need to, or owner or lenders, landlords, whoever, need to be cognizant of. The first is that they have to analyze their borrowers' taxes, because taxes are the tail that wags the dog in this industry. And if they're not doing everything they can to maximize their returns, literally and figuratively, their tax returns and their returns to their pocket, they may not be a good borrower, because almost 70% of your gross revenue goes to different types of taxes if you're not structured the right way. And if you're the landlord, or the lender for that matter, you may fall second in priority to the government, regardless of how secured you are in the real estate. So you have to be really, really careful as to the finances and operations of your borrower. I also think there's a slight risk of government seizure of that property if they do something that's federally illegal. I think that risk has minimized over the years, but it's still there. And so for lenders, we also create a different type of green writer that has other conditions of operations and rights and everything else. And in some instances, what we do is we actually have a confession of judgment. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where someone
I do remember that.
judgment ahead of time, right, so that we can put a receiver into the property right away without having to deal with the illegality issue or anything else. We just kick those people out and put an operator in until we find the next tenant. So there's a lot of different tricks of the trade that we use to protect our lending clients. But it's not for the faint of heart. Our lenders are usually either high net worth individuals, hard money lenders, family offices, and a few private equity groups that, separate and apart from their normal activities, will set up a special fund that's kind of a siloed standalone fund to deal with that type of lending.
What was that term that you used before? Was the confession of, what is it? What was it?
Oh, confession of judgment.
Confession of judgment. So I do remember those from my days in the bank. And for whatever reason, it reminds me of Armand Hammer. So apparently when Armand Hammer would hire his top executives, he'd have them sign undated letters of resignation when they came.
He did do that.
That's a heck of a way of keeping control of your crew, right?
That's right. This is very similar in that regard. But because it's such a high risk environment and it's such a high risk business right now, especially with the conflict of law, I think it's very prudent to consider it ahead of time.
Yeah, why not, right? But so now
and people are so desperate for the financing and the capital that they're willing to sign it. They're willing to take that risk.
So let me
go ahead. I was just going to add one more thing. I always recommend that in those types of loans, you also try to find a guarantor of some sort that has some sort of financial wherewithal to at least cover the costs of going through finding a new tenant and everything else, or a new operator or a new borrower or whatever. So I do recommend getting guarantees where they're available. They're not always available. The other thing I recommend is, if you're going to be a lender, to take, I call it the UCC times 3. You take 3 types of additional collateral. The first is the actual cannabis inventory or cannabis product, which as a lender, you're probably not authorized to take possession of, but you can sell that paper to someone who is, or you can get a foreclosure agent that's authorized to do that. I would take a security interest in the non-cannabis inventory, furniture, fixtures, equipment, rolling stock, etc., which you can foreclose on or sell to a foreclosing agent to handle as well. But the third is controversial, but I recommend it anyway, which is taking a lien on the actual license itself. Because by law, the licenses technically are not transferable, but I have transferred licenses through court order. And a court has the authority to transfer a license regardless of the statutory restriction. So you could turn around and sell that paper to someone that really wants the license, and they can go through the process of going to court and petitioning the court to transfer the license to them. And we've done it successfully. So it's not something that is abstract at this point. When I did it 3 years ago, it was abstract. Now we've proven the concept.
Rich, this is really cool tactics. It's very interesting. Yeah. A couple of things about the finances that you mentioned. Let me just
go ahead.
So one thing that you said that stuck in my mind was I'm pretty sure that you said 70% of revenues go to taxes. Is that what you said? So why is that? Are those like special cannabis taxes or something?
Partially, but I'll explain it in a way that makes perfect sense. So we call it the Al Capone law. There's a special section of the tax code called Section 280E. And 280E says that if you make money from something illegal, that you cannot take any deductions or depreciations, except for cost of goods sold, which is usually a nominal cost. So this is what was used to bust Al Capone and other mafia dons back in the day, because they would make all this illicit money and then they wouldn't pay taxes, or they would try to depreciate or deduct assets that were from ill-gotten gains. Well, today, fast forward to today in the 2020s, the federal government goes to these cannabis businesses and says, you can't depreciate your property, you can't deduct your rent, you can't deduct your labor, you can't do all these things. So you end up paying full freight at the federal level if you're not structured the right way, and you're paying 40%. Well, add that to the state tax, which is at 20%, and then most local taxes between 5 and 15%. So you're anywhere between 65 and 75% of gross revenue of taxes. I tell people this, that most cannabis businesses are insolvent before they even start their business, because they don't take the tax burden into consideration. And it's actually stifling the licensing process, because people realize that once they're actually not in the gray market or the black market, their gross revenue is going to go down significantly if they properly report their monies like they're supposed to. I think that the only people that will survive the next couple of years while we wait for the business to become more normal is that the ones that are going to be able to put more capital into the business, in the hopes that they can stay afloat long enough for the federal government to change the rules. And that's a hope that we don't know is going to happen or not, depending on what happens politically.
That's really fascinating. So if I'm going to be an investor in one of these deals and I'm lending debt, right, which is presumably the safest, right? We've got a first position loan. What kind of rates and leverage are we talking about? You mentioned that they were higher rates, but what about leverage as well, especially if the value of the asset is inflated from its normal highest and best use?
So if in my experience, I wouldn't lend more than 50% of the value of the property.
Which value?
I would
actually the cannabis-based value.
Exactly.
Okay.
On the non-cannabis based value, quite frankly. And that is probably, the cannabis based value probably gives you a 30 to 40% increase in market value, at least in the optical view, because I think that those numbers are inflated. But there is the non-cannabis valuation and the cannabis valuation. What's interesting is I actually have one client right now that is Chinese American, and they have found that the properties that they use for their cannabis grow facilities also work for Chinese herbal medicine, which actually sells at about the same rate that cannabis sells for, if not more. So what they do is when they have a problem with one of their cannabis growers, they just bring in an herbal grower that grows that needs the same type of equipment and everything else. And they're the only ones that I've seen retain a non-cannabis business at a cannabis close to value in that regard.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I would say this: if you're a lender, 50% is probably your threshold, maybe 60%, and I would try to base it on the non-cannabis value. But everything's negotiable, of course, right?
And what kind of rates? What kind of rate do you think? Yeah.
So 3 years ago, I was seeing 18, 20, 22%. Now I'm seeing 8 to 12% is more of the norm. We used to jokingly call it a triple. It was triple the value, triple the rent, and a triple net lease. So can we pause for a moment? Because I have a lot of background noise.
You know what? It's funny that should happen. I know that you're working out of your house today because you're president. I want you to know that I'm working out of my house and my studio today because of you. And at the exact same time that you got noise, I'm starting to hear the same thing over here.
Same thing. So let me go tell everyone.
Sure. You bet. All right. So now we've taken care of our mutual minors, spelt MINORS. Right?
Yeah.
Obviously. And I only say that because I don't know if you ever listened to Derek and Clive. Have you ever heard those tapes?
No.
Derek and Peter Cook and Dudley Moore. So they have this series.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So they have this, one of their albums said, not for sale to minors. MINER.
Yeah, MINE.
But anyway, so now
they were fantastic.
Yes, but that's probably but they were also rather shocking when they got to the Derek and Clive stuff, from the Pete and Dud to the Derek and Clive. It was a bit shocking. All right, so let's move on. I've totally forgotten where we were, but it doesn't matter. I think rates. You were telling me about the triple net rates and etc. All right.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you what.
Yes, we jokingly call it in the office. Yeah, the triple. So the triple was triple the rent, triple net lease, and now I forgot what the last triple was. Triple the value. So
triple the value.
That was our triple. Yep.
So now let's talk about the kinds of real estate that can be used for both recreational and medical cannabis industries. What are the different kinds of real estate that someone can invest in?
So in the 10 years that I've been working in the cannabis space, I have seen quite a bit. Let's start with the large and go to the small. So the largest properties we've dealt with are massive outdoor grows, are on acres and acres of land. The recreational laws actually changed the way people can grow because there's limitations on square footage and things like that. So that became kind of an issue, because if you were strictly doing medical, you didn't have the same restrictions. But if you wanted to do recreational, where a lot of people thought all the money would be, then you were then restricted on square footage. So you'd have these great big farms that had just a third of its space or less being used for cannabis and the rest being used for something else. What's interesting is that some of those farms actually made more money on the something else because of the drop in price that happened a couple of years ago for cannabis. So it actually may have worked out to saving them in the end. The most common types of property investments that I see are what I would call the halfway properties. They're greenhouse properties, where these massive, super high-tech greenhouses are being built on large plots of land. And depending on where they're located, they have environment control, sunlight control, all these different things. If they're in Northern California, they might not need the sunlight control. But if they're in Central or Southern California, then they have these special curtains that close and special windows that open and close and all these different things. Those are high-tech. They've gotten a lot of outside investment, especially from Canada. And those are very, very popular. And I think that those will survive any type of economic problems that this industry is going to face over the next couple of years, simply because the amount of investment and time and the quality of goods that comes out of those hyper-controlled environments is predictable and regular. So they have probably the best option from a growth perspective. And then you have what I would call the indoor warehouse grow. And that's interesting because that can be in a green zone in an industrialized area or in a downtown of a major city like Los Angeles. And all of a sudden you walk into a little door, and behind that door is room after room after room of indoor grow. That's also very predictable, and it creates a very high quality level of cannabis, but it also has additional costs because you have city water, you're not getting agricultural water, you're getting electricity costs for a city as well. And so your overhead is different. And then you have to have an incredible amount of machinery, HVAC machinery, heating, air conditioning, temperature control, all those types of things where you don't get any advantage from the outside elements one way or the other. You have to control all of the environment inside. Then you have what I would call the distribution centers. They're really just warehouses that are repurposed for cannabis distribution. There was a lot of movement for people to invest in these warehouse type properties where they would simply act as a conduit between the grower and the retailer. But what's interesting is that distribution never took off. The rules and regulations that the state released didn't promote having distributors the way other industries have. So like in alcohol, for example, you have the brewery, and then you have the distributor that gets it to the retailers, and the distributor deals with the shelving, deals with the way the regularity of the shipments, and they deal with the retailer directly and getting those products on the shelf. Cannabis is different. The distribution can be done by the grower itself. And so you have a lot of growers are saying, why am I going to have this middleman that's just going to raise the price of my product when I can go and distribute it myself? So you're seeing a lot of direct distribution. That may change in the future, but a lot of people lost out that bought properties that they thought would be perfect distribution hubs and centers. And they bought them, of course, in prime locations where they thought there would be a lot of demand. And a lot of them are sitting virtually empty. So it was a really bad move. Will it change? Who knows? But I don't see that changing anytime soon. And then, of course, there's the retail aspect. Retail is finding a green zone that allows you to put a retail shop. And that is not easy because every single municipality, and just think California has about 435 different local municipalities, has its own different rules and regulations. So Newport Beach, for example, doesn't allow it. But Costa Mesa, right next door, does. And then you have the issue of whether they're going to allow delivery or not allow delivery. So you have those challenges. And then the one that I think is the belle of the ball, and the one that people are not looking at right now, is the extraction and the testing. So extraction is a lab process, really, where they extract the oils from the cannabis itself. There are a number of extractors, but because of the vape crisis that happened recently and because of the way the regulations are written, it's not an easy process, and it's highly, highly regulated and requires a special kind of property, and it requires a special kind of knowledge. And so if you can get the right person with that biology knowledge or that chemical knowledge, I would say it's biochemistry knowledge, right? And get the right real estate to go hand in hand, that's a place where money can be made. The other one, though, that is really, really, there's a dearth right now of people doing it, is the testing, which doesn't require a lot of space. It just requires the right lab equipment. So if you can hire the right biochemists to do your testing, there are not enough testing facilities live right now. So the last I read, which was a couple months ago, the state needed 500 plus testing agencies. There are only 30 that are online right now. So if you can team up with a biochemist and find a property that's zoned for testing, I think you can hit a home run very easily if you get yourself out there quickly, because I think that that's not going to last, that opportunity. But there's a short-term opportunity there for the next couple of years because there's just not enough people looking at that as being a viable business. And I actually think that that could be one of the more viable businesses, because without that testing, they can't go to market. You cannot sell your product.
And you have to have you have to have a license for the real estate to have a testing facility?
Yes.
And
there's an actual special license. It's a cannabis testing license. I forget what category it is, but there's a special category for testing. And it's the category that has the least number of issuances right now.
Fascinating. So you already talked about the cost of real estate, of cannabis real estate being 3x. Are there any other kind of rules of thumb for the relative cost of cannabis real estate? And
so there's one thing that I didn't expect, and I should have expected it, that really surprised me. I always know that dealing with local governments is difficult, but there have been so many local governments that the dealings with them have led to, have bordered on corruption. And I would stay far away from those, obviously, but there are some places where there's all these under the table deals that are taking place that are just despicable. And so you need to be really aware of where you're deciding to put your business, because even if you go through all the processes, one, that local municipality, if you don't grease the right palms, will deny you, or you'll get approved and then later they're going to show up and say you have to hire my brother who's a contractor, you have to hire my cousin who's a specialist, and it really, I didn't expect California to have kind of this Latin American style, and I say that being Argentinian, so I'm very
So
familiar with it, Latin
it.
American style corruption, where
Right.
from the local to the city and everything else is corrupt. Now, there are more municipalities that are not corrupt, but I have had the misfortune of clients coming to me and saying, I'm not understanding what's going on here. And it's because those city council members couldn't be trusted. And if you look at even just the local papers, you'll see that the feds have clamped down on a few local city council members and everything else in local cities around here in the greater LA area for just that, for taking bribes on cannabis licenses and things like that. So it's making the papers, and it's something that's becoming more public.
So how do you find cannabis real estate? How does an investor find it? What kind of resources are there to identify real estate you can use it for?
So there's a few. One is that the state keeps a list of all the municipalities that have cannabis available licenses. So that's an easy place to go. But I'll tell you, the people that have had most success were the people that looked at places that didn't have a cannabis scheme yet, and went and met with the city council members to create a cannabis scheme. And so they got themselves first in line and being part of that city's efforts to put together a comprehensive plan. Now, it requires some money up front, and there's some risk that the city won't approve it. But cities that weren't online a couple years ago, like Desert Hot Springs, are now online and thriving, and a great place to do business in the cannabis world, because of a few landowners that went to the city and said, we think this zone, which has no industry whatsoever and is just lying fallow, is a perfect place to do this. And the city ultimately agreed, and they've pitched in to help pay for disposal, sewage, trash, water, power, etc. It required some upfront investing, but the fruits of their labor are now paying off. Other cities like Adelanto have done that, Cathedral City have done that, and so that's a really good play. I know someone that worked very hard to lobby the city of Burbank. And Burbank now is going to go online and have dispensaries, and I think they're going to allow for indoor grow and things like that. But 3 years ago, that was something that was not even on their radar, and a group of people went there and worked with the city, and now it is, and they're going to be the first ones to get licensed.
Fascinating. So how do cannabis sponsors finance their operations? I mean, what's the process for them? How are they setting? Are they doing crowdfunding? Are they how are they doing? How are they setting out doing it?
So all of the above. Crowdfunding is hard though, because it crosses state lines in a lot of respects, and so it becomes a federal jurisdiction, and I would be cautious in doing that. A lot of it is friends and family, and a lot of it is this. A lot of the people that, especially at the beginning, that were applying for those licenses and trying to start up those legitimate businesses were illegitimate businesses before that. And so they had cash that they were sitting on for years that they were now able to deploy in a legal manner instead of an illegal manner. I see most people getting capital from doing traditional investments, though. I've seen a lot of securities offerings in the industry that are offered only to people in California. So it doesn't go outside of state lines. They have to prove their residency. They have to do all these things. And we help them put those things together, because it's very complicated to do a fundraise and limit yourself to one state. And we make sure that the paperwork is as buttoned up as possible. But it's not easy to get that working capital. There are, though, however, some outliers there that are just amazing at raising money. One of the ones that I think of off the top of my head is Gold Flora. It's run by a woman named Lori Holcomb. She's brilliant. And she has raised money from investors, and a lot of them from institutional investors, or I wouldn't call them institutional, but private equity groups that are well known, that are willing to take a risk on her, because she's just managed these businesses in an amazing way. So it can be done, but usually I see the traditional, just like any other startup, friends and family first, then maybe a Series A, and then maybe something that follows a Series A, or you'll see like a SAFE, or you'll see a some sort of convertible note that they take out. And that has worked really well for a lot of my clients, particularly in the convertible note. That is something that people are willing to do because they get interest on their money, and if things don't go as well as they think, they can always convert it into equity or take some sort of other enforcement measure. The other thing we've done is something called preferred equity, where we have springing liens. So if things go sideways, we can start recording liens on real estate. So that's also something that is helpful and you can do. So there are a lot of options.
Are there any big players other than this lady that you mentioned who are kind of go-to for business, cannabis business loans, for example?
My clients that are lending money in this industry like to stay under the radar. They find deals more than deals find them, if that makes sense. There are people that are known on the real estate side that have done investments, and there are people that are known as putting in together fundraisers. However, or sponsors, right? Most of the money that I see that is big money is being raised on the Canadian stock market. They're doing investment funds that are raising money there and then doing cross-border investment into California. So the biggest money plays that I've seen have all come out of Canada.
That's interesting. Now, what about cannabis real estate consultants? I don't want to say agents, because agents implies, broker agent buying and selling houses. I mean, consultants, cannabis consultants. How do they get involved? What do they do, and how do they help investors?
I wish there were more, quite frankly. There are a few trusted go-to people that I know in the industry, and they help mostly with dealing with the municipal government or the local government. They deal with the zoning aspects, identifying the properties and things like that. But they're really consultants that deal with how to get yourself legally compliant locally and then at the state level. But not from a lawyer's perspective, but from more of a real estate perspective, how to get the real estate buttoned up and ready to go so that you can apply for your license, how to acquire it, those types of things. And as a matter of fact, as lawyers, we don't have boots on the ground like these guys do. So for us, it's easier to recommend our clients to hire this outside consultant to navigate the local issues or the state issues and let us deal with the investment structure, the real estate acquisition, the things that lawyers know and know how to do well.
Interesting. So what are the key things that an investor should be aware of, do you think? I'm kind of moving towards wrap up.
Yeah.
So what are kind of the key things that investors should be aware of in terms of, buying buildings or, state municipal rules, etc., zoning? I mean, you've touched on some of these things. What would be like the top three things?
Yeah. So zoning is important, obviously. So I don't think we need to talk about that more because everyone realizes you have to be zoned for the business.
Right.
I think that you need to know your operator. So whoever's using the property, you need to understand who they are and what they are and how they account for their money, because we're dealing with an industry that can't be banked right now, or in very limited circumstances can be banked. So how are you going to collect your monthly payments? How are you going to monitor how much money is coming into the business? And you need to set up protocols ahead of time and make sure that those protocols are strictly followed. That is probably the biggest challenge if you're lending money in this field. The other thing is you got to make sure that your collateral is buttoned up and you're protected from the extreme circumstances, the government seizures, the bad actors, those types of things. I'll give you a really short example. We had a client who made a loan to a business, took the real estate as security. And there was an operator who had no idea that their business partner was laundering money. And not doing what they were supposed to do and being transparent about it. Well, there was an investigation and the feds wanted to seize the property. Well, part of the blame lay with our client not setting up protocols in advance as to how to manage incoming cash, how to manage deposits, how to manage payments, all those types of things. We were able to work with the government to not have them seize the property and retain our rights and everything else, but it was something that could have been avoided, I think, had we set up protocols ahead of time. But we got the client after they had done the deal, not before. So those are the things that scare me the most as a lawyer. And then I think you need to understand your local government, and that the consultants help with that, because I'll give you a great example. Calaveras County It allowed for outdoor grow. Then 2 years later, there was an election, and the entire county council was replaced, and they voted against it. So all these people that invested a ton of money, a ton of resources, and everything else were now sitting there holding an empty bag because the county changed its mind on allowing cannabis to flourish, to even exist in their county. A year later, there was another election, and then they went back to being cannabis friendly. So you have this flip-flop, and I think if you would have known ahead of time how Calaveras County has a history of going between, left and right, left and right, left and right, you may have thought twice about investing in that county. I think now the county is married to cannabis, and they'll continue forward. But a few years ago, it was really up in the air.
Well, this kind of gets back to this first, point that we were talking about, is this political risk, even
That's
not
right.
just on the national level, on the local level as well. All right, so let me ask you one final question. What are there any, what are the most common questions that you get when somebody walks in the door and they're interested somehow in investing in cannabis or getting involved in the industry in some way?
So it's a funny thing that you ask, because this happens to me almost regularly, which is the question I get is usually in some sort of backwards negative. Like, there really is no risk for me if I do this, right? And I have to be very, very blunt and say, look, this is a risky industry. Not only do you have the risk of a bad investment or whatever, but you have a risk of your freedom and your property. If things really go sideways and there's a political change, you are now aiding and abetting a federal crime, and you have to be really cognizant of that, right? And you are also now putting your property at risk for federal seizure if you don't do things properly. So there is huge risk. Now, as lawyers, we can help you mitigate that risk, but we can't eliminate it altogether. There's no silver bullet right now to eliminate those two risks. And I'm very clear about that. The last thing I want to have anyone ever come back to me and say is, you said that I could do X and now I'm in trouble. I'm telling you, you mostly can't do X, and you can't do Y, and you can't do Z. But there is a narrow path between those three letters that you can navigate to be as safe as you possibly can. And the federal government has laws that allow for that kind of narrow path, but you have to follow it just with such discipline, and you have to just make sure that every time you turn your head, you're turning your head in the right direction.
Richard, what an enormous pleasure. Thank you so much for talking about a subject I get asked about all the time and knew nothing about. Thank you. Real pleasure, as always, to see you.
So,
by the way,
likewise.
And I'm just blown away that and I forgot his first name, Shelby. What was his first name?
Carol Shelby.
Carol Shelby. I feel honored that you knew him and that
He was amazing. Look, I've got the Cobra right there as my tribute to Carol. He was a really an interesting, unique individual.
Fabulous. Well, next time you and I'll have a chat about him as well. Thank you so much, Richard.
Appreciate it.
A real pleasure. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Adam. Likewise.
That was Richard Ormond walking us through the ins and outs of cannabis real estate. Fascinating, right? Lots of angles, and clearly an amazing opportunity to make money in real estate in this brand new industry. Just watch it explode as soon as the federal government declares it legal. Remember to check out the podcast page for today's episode, where you'll find a webcast on contracts that I put together for you, where you can access the contracts course so you know exactly what to look for when investing in any kind of real estate deal online. That's all there on the podcast page at gowercrowd.com. All right, that's it. Thanks for listening. And thank you, Richard Ormond at Buchalter, for your time with me today. That's all for this episode. I'll see you next time. And for now, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.